I think that perhaps only the prestige goods networks of the nested networks are easily amenable to archaeological study in the absence of any epigraphic or documentary sources, which we don't generally have, unlike Mesoamerica. And even then, the emphasis on quantification of the amount of goods exchanged gives me considerable pause. Like Patrick, I also want to tell you that Africa is bloody big. Right. This is using Peter's projection. That's not Peter Robertshaw's projection. That's some other famous Peter, more famous Peter. Right. And that serves to reiterate, it's hard for me or anyone else to be an expert on the whole continent, let alone distill chunks of its archaeology and history into a 15-minute presentation. But I'm going to break it down into a period somewhat following Philippe's cycles that he published in our journal Azania, Archaeological Research in Africa, in 2007. The last four are his cycles. Sometimes I'd like, in some ways, a gap, or a change at about 750 with the spread of Islam into Sub-Saharan Africa. That does seem to lead to an intensification of changes at that time. Not that I'm necessarily explaining the changes by reference to Islam. But if we start with this early period, rather arbitrarily at 2000 BCE, mostly at this point we're talking about plants and animals. This almost certainly is not a world system in the sense that it's commonly seen here. And this work comes from, this is a figure taken from, if I can sort out my damn pages here, Dorian Fuller's work on the spread of African domesticates into Asia and Asian domesticates into Africa. In particular, down here in the bottom left, the bottom left here, you have broomcorn millet reaching as far as Nubia at 1700 BC, and a bunch of African crops for which actually sometimes the earliest known archaeological dates or archaeobotanical dates, we know they're African crops, but the earliest evidence we have actually is from South Asia. And they're reaching South Asia, roughly about 1900 BC, around the end of the Harappan era. And Fuller and his colleagues think that really we're not talking about exchanges or movements of domesticates that take place within the context of state-level systems. We're probably talking about more entrepreneurial kind of traders carrying these crops to Asia and in the other direction. We also have zebu cattle shown here. We thought we had good osteological criteria for recognizing zebu cattle at one time, but I think that that's now been shown to be incorrect, and so the date of the arrival of zebu in East Africa or in Africa is no longer so clearly known. There's also, as was also mentioned, the spread of other crops into Africa, most notably the banana musa, and from Nkang here in Cameroon, there are claims that from an archaeological pit there, a banana phytolith dated to about 500 BC. I also achieved a little bit of notoriety because from a site in Uganda, I too, or Julius Ledoux, David Taylor and I, found bananas in a sediment core, or what we think a banana phytolith, for which associated with a date about 3000 BC, which we published a few years ago. But a lot of people are very skeptical of it, probably rightly so to some degree. Although if you're skeptical of ours, you should be skeptical of the Cameroonian ones too, in terms of the quality of the data. Yes. If ours were 500 BC, no one would have blinked an eye, right? Yes. Okay. But this is a map taken from Fuller and Hildebrand's synthesis in the recent Oxford Handbook of African Archaeology, and you probably can't read it from where you're sitting, but there are dates here for the first appearance of many of the various crops in Africa. And what I wanted to try to show here is that over the southern kind of 2/3 of Africa, the spread of these crops is relatively late. And it's linked to the Bantu expansion, Bantu migrations, which I would put for at least that southern half of Africa much later than Patrick was suggesting, I think. But what it seems to me to point towards is that substantial interaction networks within Africa then are not really present prior to the first centuries AD CE. At least that's, judging by the relatively slow dispersal of these crops. When we go on to the first of Philippe's cycles, we get to the Periplus and other stuff. Yes. Right. We're all familiar with the Periplus, and it's mention of the East African port of Rapta, misspelled on this map. But archaeologists have yet to discover this so-called port. And actually some of my colleagues think that it may have been little more than a beach or an inlet with no permanent settlement of any size, perhaps where trade was conducted seasonally, a place where people came down to trade in concert with the monsoons. Otherwise, in this period, clearly we have lots of communication that others have talked about through the Red Sea and up the Nile. And the other major area is trans-Saharan trade that has been the subject of some attention. Our knowledge of this trade comes primarily from the work of David Mattingly and the Leicester team in the Fazan, particularly excavations in and around the ancient capital of Garama, where there is considerable evidence for trade with the Roman Empire, and to a lesser extent with areas south of the Sahara. But there's little actual archaeological evidence of this trade in the regions south of the Sahara in this relatively early period, with a notable exception of the cemetery here at Kissi in Burkina Faso, excavated by Sonia Magnavita for her doctoral thesis. That's yielded imported glass beads, copper and brass artifacts, and even what appears to be a small amount of Roman chainmail. Geno was developing into an urban society of sorts during this period, but trans-Saharan imports are relatively few at Geno prior to 500 CE. Rather, Geno seems to have been the hub of a developing internal West African interaction network in the first centuries CE. Then we come to the second cycle, when, in a sense, the volume of prestige goods imported into East Africa increases noticeably. But I only have time in my allotted 15 minutes to mention just a couple of things, and I'm going to focus really on some of my own work, and that means what I've been working a lot on in the last decade or so is the chemistry of glass beads to reconstruct trading patterns. And what I've recently been part of a team. This is a kind of team effort, but we've recently analysed some glass from mid to late first millennium AD site on Zanzibar, and what we find there is a chemically distinctive beads found on Zanzibar as well as a couple of Kenyan sites that derive from South India or Sri Lanka. And these beads are not found in southern Africa. We think that that my arrow there shows the Rufuma River mouth, or the Rufuma River. There are two separate trading systems to the East African coast during the latter part of the first millennium AD. In southern Africa, there is a different series of beads named after Chibweni, found at Chibweni itself and in the interior of northern Botswana. This seems to have been a pre-AD 1900 trade route or route of exchange, following those red lines that went at least as far as Kaicha, which is known as a salt-producing centre, and seems to have perhaps exported salt in exchange for luxury items. Salt was a valued commodity over much of Africa because cattle needed it, and it wasn't always widely available. These beads of Chibouini series find their way as far up as Nkoma as well in Botswana. But Chibouini series beads are found at Chibouini and along this red route in the interior, but they're not found further south. I mean, this trade route, it seems to predate the beginnings of political centralization on the Limpopo in this kind of green area here, where you find a century or so after the Chibouini series a distinct series of beads known as the Zizo series of beads. Right? Zizo series beads are probably Persian in terms of where the glass was manufactured, or Iranian. But the bead making technology is, according to my colleague Marilee Wood, South Asian, and she suggests that Indian bead makers may well have been resident in the Persian Gulf region. So for the Eastern African littoral in the mid to late first millennium AD, one trade route led directly from the Persian Gulf to Mozambique, bypassing generally ports north of the Rovuma River. This route brought Chibouini and Zizo series beads from the Middle East to southern Africa. North of the Rovuma River on the coast, we find beads of South Asian glass of a type that is absent from southern Africa, suggesting a separate trade route or sphere either directly from South Asia or via the Persian Gulf. Chibouini beads are entirely absent from the East African coast, at least so far, and Zizo beads are very rare. But the same glass as that of the Zizo beads is found at Iboukwu in Nigeria and Gao in Mali, a place I didn't put on this map, with long tubes of glass probably imported into West Africa and then made into beads locally. So there were tentacles of trade reaching out across Africa from the Middle East during this period. Humming right along into the final two series, linking them together, although there are some setbacks. And again, focusing on the beads, we have actually a well-defined series of beads now that goes back, well, with the Chibouini series into the 7th century, distinctive glass beads from distinctive periods, and we've done the chemistry on these. This tells us the broad region generally of origin of the glass. Of course, doesn't tell us where the beads were made, right? It tells us where the glass was made, and we know from another of those shipwrecks, not the Uluburun one, but a later one, that raw glass was also traded, sometimes perhaps used even as ballast, quite widely around the ancient world. So glass may, for example, have been manufactured in the Middle East and then turned into beads in South Asia, right? Sometimes. So we have this quite nice, well, whatever you want to call this here, correlation. We also have this rather complicated graph here put together by Tom Fenn, who's been doing strontium isotope ratios in glass, where we have both kind of geography along the x-axis here with West Africa and Southern Africa, but also confusing it with chronology. All right, so this is basically the same period here, then we go into later periods. And the strontium isotope ratios are an indicator of origins of the glass. These lower levels indicate the Middle East, these higher levels South Asian probably, but you can see there are some variants here, so it's not all from the same place. And we can play around with this, as we did, and have a little fun and give historians a heart attack with the cavalier nature of treating history. So you can correlate this with, various historical events, right, to explain these, or try to explain, or at least point to correlations between political events and changes in patterns of movements of beads or patterns of trade. Yes. What about internal Sub-Saharan networks after c. 1000? Well, certainly in West Africa, where we see lots of these things, right? But in Central Africa, it's hard to see much at all in the way of internal African networks, right, after 1000 CE. In the Great Lakes region, by which I mean kind of the area around Lake Victoria, the area of the historical kingdoms of Rwanda and Burundi and Bunyoro and Buganda, we see the development of socio-political complexity, what I would think of states, after 1000 AD, but with relatively little evidence for external trade. There's a little bit, there are rare glass beads and so on, but we see little in the way of internal or evidence for internal interaction networks. There's one copper bracelet, for example, from a site that I've excavated, but we haven't been able to do provenience work to know whether it was from a local copper source or whether it was coming from the Zambian copper belt, right? So there's not much happening there too. Where there is quite a lot happening is in southern Africa, particularly with the first state-level society at Mapungubwe and its successor at Great Zimbabwe, right, where they clearly had connections to the interior. There was a state-level society based at Tautswe that clearly was extremely wealthy in terms of cattle pastoralism, and clearly both presumably movement of cattle, maybe salt, but also luxury items into the southern African interior. What about warfare? Since I was interested in political military networks, yes, in West Africa, certainly predatory raiding that Patrick alluded to. But in the Great Lakes region and southern Africa, warfare not really clearly evident prior to the last couple of centuries. There are sites with walls and ditches, but I would say walls and ditches do not warfare make, right? There are other explanations that are favoured for these features at both these places that seem to me make more sense than kind of warfare and external threats. And finally, I'd just like to make a couple of quick remarks on Eurocentric terminology and the like. In the little world systems literature that I've read, civilization seems to be a term commonly defined as state-level societies with cities of at least 20,000 people. However, in Eastern and Southern Africa, there may well have been no cities with that larger population prior to the 18th or even the 19th century CE. Using this definition, Great Zimbabwe is not a city, and there was no pre-colonial Zimbabwean civilization. Similarly, the states of the Great Lakes would not qualify as civilizations until very late. Now, you might think that using a term like that, it's simply a kind of operational or heuristic device, but in African and Africanist eyes, it's a term that leads to the exclusion of much of Sub-Saharan Africa from conversations about the rise of civilization, imposing an apparently arbitrary quantitative definition of a city that is Eurocentric in conception and fails to value the diversity of African political and urban forms on a continent where I suspect, rather in opposition perhaps to Patrick, that population densities were often somewhat lower than those in Europe. Moreover, in the milieu of world systems theory, most of Sub-Saharan Africa, for the majority of its pre-colonial past, is often viewed as an exploited periphery. It may indeed have been an exploited periphery. With the amount of slaves, of course, taken out of Africa, it's difficult to see it sometimes in anything other than those terms. But to think of it only in those terms is to, in a sense, to perpetuate colonialist views. And so under those circumstances, it's hard to imagine why any African prehistorians embracing world systems as a field would embrace world systems as a field of study worthy of their attention. However, a total rejection of all that a world systems perspective has to offer would seem to be a case of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Perhaps the theoretical, methodological, and analytical insights of world systems perspectives harnessed successfully to Sub-Saharan African research, if we were prepared to throw out those arbitrary quantitative thresholds, which seem primarily to designed as some kind of litmus test of whether or not an interaction network can be classified as a world system, would seem to be the way to go. Perhaps we can apply insights such as those of the nested networks discussed by Chris and others to smaller scale polities and so avoid this kind of marginalization and peripheralization of this very large continent. Thank you.